I wasn't supposed to take the night shift. Truth be told, I wasn't even supposed to work in that diner anymore. After 10 years of graveyard hours, cleaning out grease traps, and dealing with late-night drunks, I thought I'd left it behind for good. But life had other plans. My rent was overdue, and the guy who took over my old spot at Mel's Diner had vanished. Just stopped showing up, no explanation. So here I was, at 11:55 p.m., unlocking the doors to a place I thought I'd escaped. The diner was the same as always. Sticky linoleum floors, fluorescent lights that buzzed like a mosquito, and that faint smell of burnt coffee. The only difference was the silence. There was always a hum of life before. Even at 3 a.m., you'd get truckers, insomniacs, or teenagers looking for fries and milkshakes. But tonight, it felt wrong. The first hour was uneventful. I wiped down the counters, restocked the napkins, and double-checked the walk-in freezer. As I leaned against the counter scrolling through my phone, the bell above the door jingled. A man walked in. He looked ordinary in the way that makes your stomach twist, like his face was trying too hard to be forgettable. His clothes were clean but didn't fit quite right. His smile felt like it had been practiced in a mirror one too many times, and his eyes, they never left mine. Not once. "Coffee," he said, sliding into the booth closest to the counter. I nodded, grabbed a mug, and poured him a cup. When I set it down, his hand brushed mine. Felt like touching ice. "You new here?" he asked. "Nope, just filling in." He sipped his coffee and grinned. "I'm glad." There was something unsettling in the way he said it, like he knew something I didn't. I forced a smile and went back to the counter, hoping he'd leave soon. But he didn't. He just sat there, staring out the window, not drinking his coffee. After about 20 minutes, I glanced over and realized something strange. He wasn't blinking. I tried not to let it get to me. Night shift brings out the weirdos, that's just how it goes. I told myself he was probably harmless. Maybe he'd had too much caffeine already or was one of those insomniacs who wandered at odd hours. But the longer he sat there, the more I noticed how still he was. His chest barely moved, as if he wasn't breathing much. He hadn't touched the coffee since his first sip. It was still steaming, untouched. I busied myself at the counter, keeping my back to him. But I could feel his eyes boring into me, like a physical weight pressing between my shoulders. When the bell above the door jingled again, I almost jumped out of my skin. This time it was a woman. She looked to be in her late 40s, wearing a beige coat and carrying a leather bag. She smiled at me as she entered and slid into the booth across the diner, as far from the man as possible. Smart choice. I poured her a cup of coffee and brought it over. As I set it down, she leaned in close and whispered, "That guy's been following me for 3 blocks. I blinked, glancing over my shoulder. The man hadn't moved, but his eyes were no longer staring out the window. He was looking right at us. "Are you sure?" I asked, keeping my voice low. She nodded, her fingers trembling as she reached for the coffee. He didn't say anything, but I kept seeing his reflection in the shop windows. He stopped when I came in here. A cold sweat broke out across my back. The diner wasn't exactly built for defense. No security cameras, no panic buttons. Just me, a set of keys, and a landline phone behind the counter. I told her to sit tight and walked back to my station, making a show of wiping down the counter while I watched the man from the corner of my eye. He was smiling now. Not a friendly smile, but the kind that stretched too wide and showed too many teeth. When he noticed me looking, he raised his hand and waved. The woman gasped softly. "He knows," she murmured. "Knows what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She shook her head, pulling her coat tighter around her. "I don't know, but it's like he's playing a game." The bell jingled again. Relief flooded me as 2 men in heavy work boots and flannel jackets walked in. Regulars from the construction site a few blocks away. I greeted them with a smile, glad for their presence. They nodded back, grabbed a booth, and started chatting loudly about their shifts. The tension in the air eased just a little. That's when the man in the first booth stood up. The man rose slowly, like he wanted everyone to notice. His movements were deliberate, almost theatrical, as if he were savoring the moment. He smoothed his ill-fitting jacket, ran a hand through his slicked-back hair, and turned to face me fully. "Can I get the check?" he asked, his voice cutting through the low murmur of conversation. I nodded quickly, fumbling with the register to print out his receipt. My fingers felt clumsy, and it took longer than it should have. When I handed him the slip, our hands brushed again, and it felt like the temperature in the room dropped by 10 degrees. "Thanks," he said, sliding a crumpled 20 across the counter. Then he leaned in closer, his smile widening to the point of distortion. His breath smelled like cold metal. "You should lock the doors when I leave." He turned on his heel and walked out without another word, the bell above the door jingling softly in his wake. For a moment, I just stood there, trying to process what had just happened. The woman in the booth was gripping her coffee cup so tightly her knuckles were white. The construction workers had stopped their conversation, watching the door swing shut behind him. "You okay?" one of them asked. "Yeah," I lied. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. I didn't lock the doors, though I considered it. Instead, I grabbed the coffee pot and made my rounds, checking on the woman and offering refills to the guys in the corner. It was better to keep moving, to keep myself distracted. I told myself he was gone, that the night would go back to normal. But normal wasn't on the menu. It started with the lights. The fluorescent bulbs above the counter began to flicker, casting erratic shadows across the diner. I glanced up, squinting, and muttered, "Damn wiring." Then the radio behind the counter crackled to life. I hadn't even turned it on. At first, it was just static. But then I heard something faint beneath the crackle. A voice, distorted and low. "Don't lock the doors," it said. My heart stuttered. I grabbed the radio and turned the dial, hoping to change the station. The static only grew louder, the voice twisting and looping until it sounded like laughter. I yanked the plug from the wall, and the radio went dead. The construction workers noticed my panic. "Everything all right over there?" one of them called. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just a power surge or something." But it wasn't a power surge, because when I looked out the window, I saw him. The man was standing across the street, under the sickly glow of a streetlight. He was staring straight at the diner, his head tilted slightly to one side. His face was pale, almost glowing in the darkness. And he was smiling, always smiling. He raised his hand and waved. I froze, staring at him through the window. My breath caught in my throat. He didn't move, didn't even blink. Just stood there, his hand raised in that mockingly cheerful wave. The streetlight flickered above him, casting long, jittery shadows that made his figure seem to shiver and warp. "Who's that?" one of the construction workers asked, noticing my line of sight. I shook my head, forcing myself to tear my gaze away. "Just some guy," I muttered, "probably waiting for a bus." The worker frowned. "There's no bus stop over there." I felt a chill run down my spine. He was right. There wasn't a stop anywhere near that corner. And still, the man stood there, unmoving, watching. The woman in the booth shifted nervously, glancing between me and the window. "You need to call someone," she whispered. "That guy's not normal." She was right, of course, but I didn't want to admit it. The police wouldn't do anything. What would I even tell them? That some creepy guy had ordered coffee, paid his bill, and now stood outside staring? It sounded ridiculous, even to me. The bell above the door jingled, and I flinched violently, spinning around. But it wasn't him. It was another regular old Eddie, shuffling in with his usual limp. He tipped his cap to me and made his way to his favorite stool at the counter. "Evening, darlin'," he said, oblivious to the tension in the air. "Cold one out there tonight, huh?" I nodded mutely, pouring him a cup of coffee. Eddie started rambling about the weather, his old truck, and the repairs he needed to make. I tried to listen, but my eyes kept drifting back to the window. The man was still there, his pale figure illuminated by the flickering streetlight. And then, he wasn't. I blinked, scanning the street frantically. He was gone. No sign of him anywhere. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. The lights in the diner flickered again, then went out entirely. For a moment, everything was pitch black, save for the faint glow of the emergency exit sign near the back. The diner fell silent, the hum of the fluorescent bulbs and the soft clinking of dishes replaced by an oppressive, suffocating quiet. "Hey, what's going on?" one of the construction workers called. His voice sounded small, swallowed up by the darkness. "I don't know," I said, fumbling for the flashlight we kept under the counter. My fingers brushed against it just as the lights came back on, flooding the diner with their harsh, buzzing glow. The relief was instant but fleeting, because when I looked at the booth where the woman had been sitting, it was empty. The coffee cup she'd been clutching was still there, half full and still steaming. Her coat was draped over the back of the seat, but she was gone, just gone. The construction workers noticed it too. "Where'd she go?" one of them asked, standing up and looking around. I didn't have an answer. My stomach churned as I scanned the diner, hoping she just slipped off to the restroom without me noticing. But something told me that wasn't the case. The bell jingled again. I turned toward the door, expecting to see her walking back in, but the door hadn't moved. It was still shut tight. The bell had jingled, but no one had entered or left. "What the hell is going on?" one of the workers muttered, his voice tinged with unease. And then I heard it, a low, rasping breath, coming from somewhere behind me. The sound was faint but unmistakable. A slow, wet rasp, like someone struggling to inhale through broken lungs. It came from behind the counter, where the kitchen doors swung softly on their hinges. My body stiffened, and I felt every hair on my neck stand on end. "Did you hear that?" one of the construction workers asked, his voice trembling. I nodded slowly, gripping the flashlight like it was a weapon. The kitchen was dark, its overhead light bulb buzzing faintly as it struggled to flicker to life. For a long moment, none of us moved. The diner felt frozen in time, every sound amplified by the tense silence. Then the rasping stopped. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned forward slightly, trying to peer through the swinging doors into the kitchen's shadowy depths. "Hello," I called, my voice barely above a whisper. The only response was the quiet creak of the doors swinging inward. Eddie, still perched on his stool, glanced at me with a nervous chuckle. "Probably just a rat," he said, though his voice lacked its usual joviality. "Or one of those big possums. They get into places like this." But I knew it wasn't a rat. It wasn't a possum either. Something about that sound, about the way the air in the room had changed, told me that whatever was back there wasn't anything natural. I stepped around the counter, gripping the flashlight tightly in one hand. The beam shook slightly as I pushed the kitchen door open with my foot. The light swept over the stainless steel counters and sinks, the rows of utensils hanging from their hooks, the battered stove that had seen decades of use. Everything looked normal except for the walk-in freezer door. It was open, not just open, wide open. Its heavy metal door swung back against the wall. I distinctly remembered closing it earlier. The cold air spilled out into the kitchen like a creeping fog, and with it came something else. A smell, rotten and metallic, thick enough to make my stomach churn. "Hello," I called again, stepping closer to the freezer. My voice echoed faintly against the tile walls. The flashlight's beam pierced the icy darkness inside the freezer, revealing shelves of boxed vegetables and vacuum-sealed meat. Nothing out of place at first. Then I saw it. In the far corner of the freezer, half hidden behind a stack of crates, something shifted. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if it wanted to be seen. "Hey!" I snapped, more out of fear than courage. "You're not supposed to be back here." The thing stepped into the light, and my breath hitched. It was the man, only it wasn't. His face was even paler now, almost translucent. His skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. His eyes, wide and gleaming, had no color, just black, empty pits that seemed to drink in the light. His mouth hung open slightly, revealing teeth that looked too long, too sharp. His body was wrong too, bent at odd angles as if his joints didn't work the way they should. He took a step toward me, his movements jerky and inhuman. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. The beam spun wildly, casting eerie shadows across the walls. My heart pounded as I scrambled to pick it up, but by the time I did, the freezer was empty. The man, or whatever he was gone. But the freezer door was still wide open, and the smell of decay hung heavy in the air. I didn't have time to process what I'd just seen. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. The cold from the freezer seemed to spill into the entire diner now, wrapping around me like icy chains. I stumbled back into the main room, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. The construction workers were standing now, their faces pale. "What's going on?" one of them demanded. What the hell was that sound? Before I could answer, the bell above the door jingled again. This time, the door didn't open, but the sound echoed through the room like a warning. We all froze, eyes darting toward the entrance. That's when the lights flickered again. The diner plunged into darkness for a split second before the emergency lights kicked in, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting and shifting like they had a life of their own. "Enough of this," one of the construction workers barked, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling the cops." He dialed, his hands trembling, but when he pressed the phone to his ear, his expression changed. His eyes widened, and he yanked the phone away, staring at it like it had bitten him. "It's dead," he stammered. "No signal." Eddie, still at the counter, clutched his coffee cup like it was the only thing tethering him to reality. "This isn't right," he whispered. "This place feels wrong." He was right. The air felt heavier now, charged with something I couldn't name. It was as if the diner itself was alive, watching us, waiting. And then we heard it. The rasping breath was back, louder this time, echoing through the diner like a low, guttural growl. It was everywhere and nowhere, coming from all around us. The red emergency lights flickered, and I caught a glimpse of movement near the back of the room. The man, or the thing pretending to be a man, was standing in the shadows by the corner booth. His body seemed to flicker with the lights, like he wasn't fully there, like he was caught between two worlds. His head tilted at an unnatural angle, and his mouth stretched into that same grotesque smile. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed, not at me, but at the woman's abandoned booth. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. The woman's coat was gone. So was her coffee cup. It was as if she had never been there at all. The construction workers backed away slowly, one of them grabbing a chair like it would do any good. "We need to get out of here," the other muttered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, edging toward the door. My fingers fumbled with the keys in my pocket, desperate to grab the one for the front lock. But before I could reach it, the bell above the door jangled violently, the sound so loud it made my ears ring. The door flew open, slamming against the wall. Cold air rushed in, bringing with it the metallic stench of decay. And standing there, framed by the night, were more figures, just like him. Their faces were blank, their eyes black voids. They moved in perfect unison, stepping into the diner with a slow, deliberate rhythm. We backed into the center of the room, the five of us huddled together. Eddie muttered a prayer under his breath, his voice trembling. The figures surrounded us, their movements impossibly smooth, like gliding shadows. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What do you want from us?" The first man, the one who started it all, stepped forward, his smile widening even further. His mouth opened, and for the first time he spoke. "You're in our way." Before I could even process what he meant, the red lights flickered one last time and went out completely. In the suffocating darkness, I heard the others scream, their voices cut short one by one. I felt something cold brush against my arm, and then nothing. I woke up in the diner hours later, the morning light streaming through the windows. The place was spotless. No broken lights, no blood, no signs of struggle. The booths were empty, the air warm and still. But I wasn't alone. Sitting on the counter was a steaming cup of coffee and a note, written in spidery handwriting. You should have locked the doors. I quit that day. Never went back. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside my apartment, I swear I can hear the bell above the diner door jingling. And I know somewhere they're still watching.